This recording was brought to you by King's Church Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz.
Doesn't know who I am. I'm Ruth. This is my husband Jeremy, and I'm going to start the ball rolling today. So the topic we were given was to talk on was phrased as a question: what is the meaning of the times that we're living in? So that's what we're going to talk about. People who know me will know that because of all the training I've had, I tend to just answer it with another quick question, which is, what do you mean by meaning? But I'm not going to go into that because it'll just be a bit boring to explore today. So I'll skip that one, and I'll go on to talking about where Jeremy and I end up when we ask ourselves, what do the times that we live in mean at the moment? So we're going to try and team tag our way through this, but I'm getting things started, as you can see. So I'm moving into my final year in a PhD where I've spent years looking at how people see the world and how and why they shape their ideas about the things they believe. So that's basically what my topic is. The word for this is worldview, and it's a way of seeing. It's the way you see the world around you and how you interpret it. So in essence, what worldview is, it's what you believe about anything and everything. So worldview is what shapes who you are. It's your attitudes, your behaviors, your morals and your ethics, the way you treat other people, how you discipline your kids, the way you vote, who you worship, or what you hope for. That's all down to your worldview. That's what it is. It's a way of seeing. Most of us are not really fully aware of what our worldview is. It just sort of creeps up on you without you noticing it or thinking about it. And so it's just something you just sort of acquire as you go through life. Very few people actually spend time thinking about what their worldview is. Although, funnily enough, quite often we comment on other people's worldviews, especially the people who annoy us. So we do find ourselves talking about others' worldviews, but we don't actually think about what our worldview is. So it's only been in the past couple of 100 years that people have actually started thinking, philosophers and people like that have started thinking about what worldview is and how it affects us. But I'm quite certain that the biblical writers had a sense of worldview. So I'm just going to read out to you a verse that Paul wrote. It's found in Romans 2:12, and you'll be familiar with it. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So what Paul was talking about here was the need to transform your mind. In other words, your worldview. And that's what we want to talk about today, is worldview. So when I've been doing my research for my studies, I've come across all sorts of answers to the questions, what is the meaning of the times we're in? So I'm just going to go through some of them. So if we ask that question, there's quite a wide range of responses that you get, particularly from Christians. The Christians have a wider range of options to them. So a lot of people, if you say to them, well, what is the meaning of the times that we're in today? Christians will often say things like, it means the world's getting worse and worse. Or it means the world has forgotten God. Some people say it means we're in the end times. Other people say it means we need to prepare ourselves. Although I've found that often people don't make it clear about exactly what we're preparing for and how we go about that. So that one's always sort of left a little bit unanswered. Sometimes Christians talk about the meaning of the times in the same way as those who don't live in a relationship with God. So they say the same things as people who don't have a faith. Sometimes they say it means I can't live my life the way I want to. COVID's interfered with my life. I can't do what I want to do. Or it means my personal rights are being trampled on. So sometimes that's the response we get. Other people say it doesn't mean anything. The world has always known plagues, earthquakes, terrible leaders, or death and destruction. So when you think about what do the present time means, there's a whole range of options you can come up with in terms of answers. as a Christian, I'm only interested in looking at the question from one angle, and that is, what is God's view of it all? This is because hopefully when we become Christians, one of the things that happens is that we change, things change. And the biggest change of all is that we're no longer tied to seeing the world the way we did before we became Christians. What Paul was trying to get at in the Romans verse was that now we are Christians, we no longer carry around the viewpoint that the world teaches us to have. Our viewpoint changes. We're transformed by the renewal of our mind into seeing things God's way. The biggest lesson, and the one that took me longest to learn in my Christian life, was to switch my view from looking at the circumstances around me and trying to interpret them through my own worldview, to looking at them with God's worldview. In other words, looking at life through a lens that was shaped with God. Another way to talk about this is to say we have a new point of reference when we become a Christian. So that raises a new question. What does it involve to look at the world around us through God's lens? How do we do it? What does God want from us in terms of the way we look at the world? What's really He after here in His relationship with us? So what I'm going to do is hand over to Jeremy. He's famous for his metaphors when he's teaching, so he's going to come up with a metaphor for you. So here you go.
So, remember the two questions that Ruth, or the profound statements that I think come out of what she said. We're being transformed by the renewing of our minds. That God has a worldview, and conceivably He wants us to see the world through His view. This is where we're going with this. So, God's worldview, well, it applies to individuals. It applies to how you and I see the world, but also contributes to how the church is going to see the world, because we're a body. We're going to influence each other. We're going to love and submit our worldviews to each other and bring a communal sense of, the question is what, out of that collectiveness. And of course the church has a worldview that influences our individual worldviews. So we keep that in mind. There's always a little bit of a tension between those. But let's just say that the way that God sees us, so His worldview is that we're a Mercedes AMG GT. Petrol injected engine. And if you look on YouTube, you'll see a Mercedes AGM GT is pretty sleek, shiny, fast. And you go, whoa, that's how God sees us. He sees us as this amazing creation. But what if, as a petrol engine, we decide we're going to put diesel into it? It's not going to go so well. And let's just say that as a modern society, but even as a church sometimes, has designed Mercedes AMG GTs, all we're getting is diesel as our food and our drink. And I say the church could be doing this as well, because the church is often copying what the world is. And so therefore, what is the worldview that the church develops that is not that much different from the way the world develops? If we've both got the same fuel and the fuel isn't quite right, we're just spluttering along. We're not really shining out God's glory if all we've got is diesel. We're wondering vaguely what's gone wrong. We're not making a difference. The world is in all its troubles, but it's still not hearing the message or the worldview that we've got to give our gospel, because we're spluttering along as well. We're sort of eating the same food and drinking the same drink. Are we even preaching something that's different from what the world already knows? And we could go looking for fixes. We could put this Mercedes into the garage, change the spark plugs, change the carburetor, put in a new turbocharger. Or we could have another committee meeting or devise a plan and a strategy and a mission outreach, a building program. But you see the point? We're not going to really change unless we change what's going into us. Is that clear enough? What if we did put petrol in? And what is petrol? Or what is diesel? What is the difference? This is the question that Ruth and I are digging down into today, okay? If we're going to have a worldview, we have to see what's feeding us. Where are we getting our food? Where are we getting our scriptures? Where are we getting our, whatever it is we're going to talk about next, into us? That's incredibly important. And the church needs to be able to separate those two foods. So if the world is struggling, and we've lost things, we've lost peace, security, sense of relatedness perhaps, connection perhaps. We've all got a story, and that's what we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks. We still want to know what we do if we're lost in that. What do we do? How do we respond? How do we bring something different to the world that can't quite see its way through? What I want to say is, if there's soul searching through this time, well, there ought to be God searching or petrol searching. That's our reference point.
So what Jeremy's been talking about is finding a new way to look at the circumstances of life and what it involves. But this can be a real challenge. Sometimes we just feel overwhelmed anyway. Maybe lockdown was just too hard, or maybe things happening in our lives just continually get us down. Maybe there's a problem that we continually struggle with that we just can't get on top of. So what I've had to learn is that when things get overwhelming, I need to take some time to ask myself a few questions. So here's the type of questions I've discovered to help me challenge myself when I start to panic about the way things are and how nothing ever seems to change. I have to ask myself, where do I place my trust? And then secondly, I ask myself, where am I placing my focus? I'll tell you a little story that will illustrate this. My mind is fairly political, and I watch world events with interest and plenty of opinion. So during the lead up to the recent election in the USA, I developed a sense of dread about the outcome that just got bigger as time went on. And I have to confess that I put a lot more energy into thinking about the American election than our own that was a few weeks earlier. And this is probably because I spent a good chunk of my adult life living right on the border between the US and Canada, and I learned that American issues are very important to your everyday life. But one night in the lead up to the American election, I woke up in the middle of the night fretting, and so I decided to pray until I fell back to sleep. So I prayed all the usual prayers that we often do. Lord, please make things happen this way. Lord, please don't let this happen. Lord, please intervene. Lord, please, please. But after a while of this, it sort of felt wrong. And I ended up praying, actually, Lord, I don't know how to pray about this. I just don't know how to formulate my prayers. I just felt like something was wrong in my praying. It didn't sit right with me. How I felt was I was sort of like praying for my football team to win the big game, and then leaving it up to God to figure out what to do about the other Christians praying for the opposing team to win. It just sort of like, how does he sort that one out? And that's how it felt to me. I also found myself wondering how my individual prayers could actually be the means of turning a gigantic ship around in the middle of the ocean. So eventually I got back to sleep, and when I got up in the morning, I started to pray again. And this time I started praying properly, not into the situation with the election, but where God sits with it. And as I prayed longer and deeper, I realized that God wasn't wanting me to pray into the election outcome at all. What he wanted from me was to pray into what I was prepared to do with my own will, my own feelings, my own opinions, my sense of dread, and my own ideas about what the best outcome would be. The longer I prayed, the more I found that what God was asking of me was to give all of that up to him, all of my own will and ideas and opinions and feelings and all that sort of stuff, and to lay all of that at the foot of his throne, all my worries, all my hopes, all my fears. What I was to pick up was his grace, his love, his care for the world. Everything else belonged to him. All the things that I felt about it belonged to him. And it was not my job to hold on to the things that I thought should happen. What it did was it completely lifted my sense of anxiety or dread for me. I still followed the election closely. I watched as, each state's vote changed and grew, and tried to calculate where everything was headed. But I didn't fret at all. I didn't find myself fretting at all. The outcome belonged to God. And my place was inside his worldview, recognizing his sovereignty and resting inside my trust for him. So this is where peace comes from. And I was amazed in the coming days that it stayed with me. It felt like coming home to the place I belonged. So what I'm talking about is coming to the place where we have a new way of seeing. The problems are still there. Life is still tough. Things happen that we don't like and that we don't want to happen. But it is possible to find inside God's sovereignty a peace that carries through any storm that comes our way. This is what I had to learn when we were confronted with issues of drug addiction, mental illness, fear of suicide and violence inside our own family. I didn't do well through it all. It took me years to figure out and learn what it really meant to trust God. This isn't a straightforward journey, so it's not something that just happens overnight. It literally took years. In my lifetime, I've often heard sermons that tell us just to try a little harder, do this, do that, read your Bible more, pray more, follow this practice, or live this way. None of that's bad advice. We do absolutely need to stay in touch with our relationship with God. But really, what I've found is that coming into the safe and healing places in God's presence more often than not involves letting go, relinquishing something that I was holding on to and saying, okay, God, it's all yours. You know best what to do with this. I think that's the place Paul got to when he talked about his thorn in the flesh. That's in 2 Corinthians 12. You'll know that verse or that passage. He prayed for the thorn in his flesh to leave him, but it didn't. So what did he do? How Paul handled it was to step into acceptance that God's grace was sufficient. That's all he needed, no matter what happened next. So, go back to Jeremy.
Are you starting to see the two types of fuel? We would call diesel the food, the world's food, the wrong food. What Ruth was feeling when she first prayed about the American election, the fret, the worry, the anxiety, that seems to be the world's way of doing things. Over concern. God, do it my way. Clamoring to God, do it my way. That seems to be diesel. Petrol seems to be your will, Lord. You've made promises. Please give me peace about this promise. Please give me hope about this promise, that it will come. So there's a test of faith that's going on. Faith that we can love God and do His will without being afraid that it's not going to happen, that it's not going to work out. That's part of petrol. Despite what we think, despite what we lack, despite not having what we think we want, we still radiate. We radiate something out to the world. We take our light from under the bushel. This is what Christians are called to do. That's why we have petrol, to shine God's light, even though we fret or angst inside. We're not going to doubt or be afraid for too long, because that food of getting to know Jesus, that hope of holding on to Him, becomes true. It becomes a true Christ that becomes a reality and tangible. The hope becomes a reality. then we won't have suspicions, we won't have mistrust, we won't doubt. Because Christ is going deeper and deeper into the heart. There's a greater sense he is there, despite I can't feel the niceness. It's a cloudy, gloomy, rainy, stormy day, but there is something taking hold deeper inside. So these times have been a real leveler, haven't they? We've all gone through fairly similar things across countries, across cultures and races and tribes and tongues. But we're learning to be a church in that. That's the positive for us. We're getting good old petrol. We're getting used to having reliance on God, not the things that we have as the trappings of the world. So it's a good time to know Christ. Know that God is a provider. He does good things. He does miracles, but not only those things. And here's the special thing about it, and we don't really latch onto this too often. God is a holy God, and he wants us to be holy. And that's really what petrol does. It separates us from the ways that the world is doing things. And we're following a path, and as we follow the path with his petrol, we're being changed in the motion of following him. That is why he has made us as this Mercedes, and I always have to remind myself, AGM GT petrol-injected car, to travel a journey that brings a certain wonderment that we are getting through. It's a glory that comes out of us, a radiance that comes out of us, because the right petrol is sustaining us. And that sustainingness is more than just having the look of things. He's not changing us just on the outside back to remodel the Mercedes AGM GT. He's sustaining something deeper in the engine. Something a little bit more fashioned that can't always be seen. Faith, trust, extreme amounts of faith and trust. Knowledge of God. How do we know God? Through deep relationship with Jesus and his Holy Spirit. It's a life, a lifestyle, a rhythm dedicated to living and getting used to Christ. It's a desire for us collectively to live as a body in Christ. A submission, as we've been hearing going through the book of Acts, submitting one to another, hearing, feeling, humbling. That story of Wayne's is sort of ringing in my ears as he introduced us today, that humbling back down to listen and hear. To pray, to worship. Well, it could turn into a bit of a list, couldn't it? But if we take the worldview approach, the way that God sees things, these things are becoming more natural to us. They're not being driven into us by legalism or do's this and don'ts that. It's a sense that, yes, our emotions inside are changing, but also our minds are changing, and the two connecting are saying, well, the Spirit is doing this thing, and it's not me that's doing this thing. In the words of my mechanic when I had a VW 1957, I've got to say that, so 1957, not 1958, was, if you want to know what true petrol is it going to come through? You suck it and see. I said, what? You suck the petrol to see if it's going to come through the carburetor and feed your engine. Okay, well, let's suck it and see with God. Can he truly provide through this sort of time? The diesel, to remind ourselves, could be the easy answers, the answers on a plate, the instant provision, the instant reassurance, the freedom from anxiety. That would be great. The prosperity, the death and destruction on our enemies. But it's not quite the Jesus petrol. It's a kind of a false fake Christ that you can hear in some gospels in some places. And I want to say this as I shortly hand back to Ruth. The true petrol instills in us an ability to love, even when we don't feel like it. a love that we do with all our soul, all our strength, all our mind, all our heart. And we love our neighbours with that love, and we ring them up and say, what I can give you for breakfast? Can I come over and cook your eggs? Can I feed your dog? Look, I don't mind if you go on holiday, I'll look after your house. You know, that's the love you want to do. You just feel it deep inside. And why do we want to do that? Because God sustains us. That's the power that we read of in Ephesians. The power in Ephesians is not to do wonders and miracles. It's to see this miraculous thing happen, that we, these humble vessels, these pots of clay, as Paul calls them, are sustained through a dangerous, stormy world. That power, that petrol, is quite extraordinary. And it's a power that also that Paul asks us to have alertness to the false ways that the world's going to operate. So we do have to have that sense. There's a falseness there that we do have to take regard of. Now it takes pause now just to look at those two reference points. The worldview the world's going to give us is sustaining just me, just what I want. The petrol that God gives us is sustaining me to give outwards, to connect with us, to connect with out there.
So there's one more last thing that we want to talk about, and that's a bit of a trap that can be easy to fall into. Relying on, leaning on our trust in God is one of the ways that we can enter into God's presence. But entering into God's presence doesn't mean we're leaving the earth. Life still goes on. More than often than not, the problems still carry on. And often you have to do something about them. You can't just pray into a problem with your child at school and then leave it at that. You've got to do something about it. Sometimes with some problems, there is a temptation to do that though. If I pray into this, the problem will just dissolve and go away, and then it's all sorted. And so we invest our energies into that. But sometimes with some problems, when there's a temptation to do that, it's a matter of you're actually avoiding dealing with some things. And one way of avoiding dealing with the problems is to over-spiritualize them. And you put a lot of human effort into convincing yourself and others that we're walking in God's presence. We have to make sure we're not just doing this as a way to avoid the pain. So the question is, how do we make sure we don't over-spiritualize things just to help us avoid the problem? Paul was still left with his thorn in the flesh. He still had to face how he was going to deal with it in everyday life. The point is that God is still there. He's still in that situation, even as we have to deal with it. He's promised us he's always there. We're probably all familiar with the passage in Isaiah 43, verse 2, that we read quite often. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. The fire and the waters are still there. We still have to get through them. But our comfort is God with us. His grace is sufficient. Jeremy's going to have the last word.
Which is very rare in a household of two last little metaphor scriptures to hold in your mind of the sustaining God. I love the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, crossing a desert, reaching the Jordan, entering the promised land. And there were so many things that got in the way that they couldn't sustain that journey, and we won't rehearse those here. But the critical bit that really got them there was both a transcendent God on the mountain, God on Sinai, and an immanent God. A God that is present as we know it through the Holy Spirit. And if we're thinking of not over-spiritualizing, as Ruth said, then we have to be more intimately aware of that imminent presence of God, as much as the transcendent miracles, power, displays, whatever we project that as being. That's also reflected in Psalm 23. So putting these two thoughts together, crossing the desert like the Israelites, hard, harsh desert, going through the valley of the shadow of death. If you know Psalm 23, yea, though I go through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thy rod and thy staff are with me. They shall comfort me. And then the verse goes on, surely, I will sit at the table of the Lord in the presence of my enemies, and there's abundance before me. Transcendence versus the going through the valley experience. And so I just want, perhaps Ruth and I will share this thought that bringing Jesus close sustains us through that desert or through that valley. It's a promise. It's a hope we carry. We have to hold that hope a lot more dearly, a lot more closely than we often do. Because that hope is also God's hope, that we will step out beyond the door, take off the bushel that's hiding our light, and give something of this hope to the world, something of God's glory shining through us that begins to sustain them to see something beyond the traumas they're in. My last little thought on that is, if they're going through the desert and we've reached the promised land of knowing we can depend on God, would we be willing to go back to Egypt to bring them through the desert, sustaining them? That's what I think the church is for. God sustains us, we reach out, we begin to sustain the world in a new view of what is possible, other than what we've got. With that, would someone like to say a prayer of helping us in that vision of sustaining through the Spirit of God, sustaining out to the world?
This video recording is brought to you by King's Church, Christchurch, New Zealand. www.kingschurch.co.nz